Welcome back to our virtual pilgrimage of freedom. Today I've taken you more than 800 steps from the bottom of what they call the basin in Petra to this beautiful place which is called Adir, or the monastery. That's how you say that in Arabic. And so this incredible structure is one of the most beautiful here in Petra and one of the most well preserved. But it takes a little bit of effort and really self-mastery to get up those stairs and make it. We came early in the morning with you on this beautiful sunny day to talk about not only this wonder of the world, but also to use it as a platform to jump into the realities, the truths, and the love that the Lord wants to tell us about in the Sixth Commandment. So let's talk a little bit more about what we're seeing, and welcome back to our pilgrimage. We are standing in front of another one of these amazing monuments. And this is one of the largest. And I think it stands out especially because there's nothing that's carved around it. And so it's sort of this self-standing place. But what you can notice so well is, of course, like everything else, it was carved from the top to the bottom. This is how the Nabateans would carve their temples. Actually, they weren't temples. They were funerary monuments. At least that's what most people think they were. And so there's a stairway. They probably actually went up to the cliff behind us because we're just surrounded by these beautiful mountains and little caves all over the place. And so they would have started from the very top. And to think about how they would have made their way down in such a beautiful way to make it so straight, so aesthetically pleasing, and so massive. I mean, it takes a lot of work because you can also see from the sides on either side of this monastery that this was a mountainside. And so they just took all of that rock away. And even, in this whole area, there's this big square. And so the theory of the archaeologists is that this was probably used for assembly. So people could come together in front of this building. And then it also has a structure so that the water runs past it if there's ever a flash flood. And that would keep it from being damaged. So you're thinking, okay, well, what would that mean that this is? Well, they've dated it back to the first half of the first century. So that means around 50, 60 AD is when this was built. And it's not, if you're thinking about some of the other things we've seen, it's not as ornate. You don't have a lot of the Greek architecture in here. The columns are Doric, but of course it has that classical style. And so it's that eclectic nature of bringing in all the different civilizations around it, the Nabateans, because they had so many people coming through here, that's reflected in their architecture. Most archaeologists think that, again, like the other things we've seen, this would have been the tomb of a very wealthy person, most likely the tomb of a king. They didn't find anyone inside, but what they often say here, and what I think really typifies Petra, and what really probably struck the caravans when they came through, or the people going through the desert that came through here, is that these buildings were made to last for eternity. The earthquake that devastated the downtown area, the living quarters, and really a good portion of Petra, didn't damage these types of buildings. And this probably reflects on their belief about eternal life. If what's built by human hands and for daily living is going to last a couple of decades, maybe 100 years, this is not going to be moved because it's made from the mountain itself. And so that's actually what we witness right here. So who was the king that was probably buried in here? Well, one of the theories that they have, it was a king. Let me just look at his name because I always forget what it is. It's Obadas or something like that. But the reason he was here is because he had an amazing victory over the Hasmonean Empire. So it was epic, and they probably built it after that. So what were these battles? Well, approximately about around that time. They think they were the battles of Cana and the battles of Gadara. Now, we know those areas because they're the other side of the Jordan, the other part of the Holy Land here. When were those battles fought? Well, the first was fought in 93 BC, when the Hasmoneans controlled several territories, including Gaza. Now, for Petra, that was an extremely important port. And so they wanted to maintain, for the Nabateans, they wanted to maintain their control over it. So that seaport, if it was taken away by the Hasmoneans, that was a problem. And so King Obodas, he actually ambushed Alexander Jannaeus, who was the guy who was in charge, with a camel cavalry. Isn't that just perfect? If you've never seen a camel running through the desert, which we did in Sinai, you don't realize how big they are, how fast they are, and how frightening they are. We actually had to run off the road because it would be quite a thing to deal with. And so they were actually conquered by that camel cavalry. And then he also defeated the Seleucids. They were the Greeks at the Battle of Cana and killed their king. And so there he got control over Gaza, Damascus, and other cities that were so important for trade. But the reason we're here today is because it's not the king and his victories, but it's what happened to this edifice afterwards and what gives it its name according to the locals. And that's what they're actually going after, the archaeologists and people, when they're trying to reconstruct the society, because it was lost for so many years. They call it the monastery. And if you look around this place, just like the rest of Petra, it's dotted with caves. They call them hermitages. And because of the Byzantine crosses that actually decorate part of this area, the benches that are inside, and there's a dais, which looks like a place where there would be an altar and then seating for the clergy. This was converted also into a church and actually a Byzantine monastery. In fact, they say when you leave downtown Petra and you make your way through the canyon areas, there's a lot of caves there. And this becomes almost a pilgrim route. You have to make a decision to come up here. So it probably was a spiritual journey and a spiritual path. So if we had these monks living here, praying for the people in Petra, and particularly the people that came through, including pilgrims like you and like me, making their way to the different holy sites on this side of the Jordan, the other side of the Jordan, and in Egypt, well, we think about their life and what they lived: poverty, chastity, and obedience. And that's one of the main themes of the Sixth Commandment. So let's talk a little bit more about that. So, thinking about the monks and their lives, what is it that the Sixth Commandment tells us that has to do with the way that they lived and the way we're all called to live? Well, very clearly in Exodus it says, "You shall not commit adultery." And then the Lord goes on and talks about that a little bit further on the Sermon on the Mount, saying, "You have heard that it was said, 'You shall not commit adultery,' but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." So these are very clear precepts. But what it takes us back to is that very first covenant in Genesis 1. It reminds us that God is love, and we're called to enter into that. We're called to enter into a relationship not only with him, but with the others around us, and that's part of who we are. Now, in Genesis 1, it talks about the fact that he created the human race, each one of us, in his own image and likeness. So that means he inscribed within us, within man and woman, the vocation, and therefore the capacity and the responsibility to love, for love and communion. Now, I'm going to put a title of a book in the notes where you can go and read more about this. It's a classic from Cardinal Wojtyła, Love and Responsibility. This is exactly where this commandment is pointing us to. It's our vocation. It's what we're called to live. And that's why in Genesis 1, it says that we were created in his image. Now, in ancient civilizations, they talked about, if you had a king and he had his kingdom, he would put images of himself all around the kingdom to show under whose authority the kingdom was. So that was his image and his likeness. Now, what's incredible about the Lord is he made mankind in his image and likeness. And he sent us out as living images all over the world, which for him is his kingdom, Christ the King. That's his whole desire and the end point of everything that we're doing. So this is something that tells us if we're in his image and likeness and we are called to love and responsibility, that actually tells us something about who we are inside, especially when we're talking about the Sixth Commandment, and that is sexuality. It affects all dimensions of the human person, and that's what Cardinal Wojtyła talks about. It affects our body, our soul, and particularly our affectivity, the way that we love. So we're called to love, and that means participating in him, called to spread life and love. That means to procreate and to make bonds of communion with one another. And so that's why understanding all of this, our sexual identity, and identifying with who we really are as man and woman is so important. There's a moral difference, a physical difference, a spiritual difference between men and women. That's what's revealed in Genesis 1. And this is so important in the world today. That difference, that differentiation on all those levels is the harmony that will create a harmonic society. Not just relationships, but also all of the relationships in civil society. A harmony of the couple and of society depends in part on the way in which the complementarity of man and woman, the needs of men and women, and the mutual support between them are lived out. That is a basic truth which we need to understand more and more today and help people to reflect on. We don't even want to come close to this topic. I don't want to talk about it, most people say, because it is so polemic. It's very polemic. But we need to go back to what's revealed to us and what philosophically is revealed to us in our own phenomenology, in the way that we're made. What does our body tell us about who our souls are? So I invite a lot of you to go into this philosophical reflection on why we're made, who we are, and how we're made. So again, as the second part of the sixth commandment that I just read points us to, Jesus came to restore creation to the purity of its origins. In other words, to bring us back to what we were created for. And so on the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus says, "You have heard that it was said," like I said, "anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart." So that means also what God has joined together, let no man put asunder, which is typical for a wedding vow. Because of that, because of the revelation that comes from God himself, the church has understood the sixth commandment as encompassing the whole of human sexuality. So then, I want to just underline another point, and that is about the law. The law is not a restriction. It's not just because we are prudish and we don't want to do things. No. When we're talking about God's law, it's because he's a father that wants to take care of his children, just like I would suppose a parent who wouldn't let their kids play out in the street. Is he being a tyrant? No, he's trying to protect them so they can grow up and be happy and be safe. And so in that sense, that's sort of what the law is. And when we're talking about following the law or breaking the law, it's not the law that we're breaking when we're talking about God's law. When we break, for example, this commandment, what's broken is our heart. What's broken is our capacity to love and enter into relationship, not only of ourselves, but those that are around us. And that's why it's so important to understand that this is covenant and not just a legalism. I mean, obviously, if we're going against the nature of something, it's kind of a weird example, but I heard this once in my own class of philosophy. Ironing, steam iron. Okay, a steam iron is used to iron clothes. If you use a steam iron to make grilled cheese sandwiches, you're going to ruin the iron. Okay, it's going to be impossible to get the grease and the cheese. You might have a great grilled cheese sandwich first, like the first time, but you've ruined it. When we go against our nature, we're ruined. But what do we know what our nature is? Philosophy, reflection, listening to revelation, listening to our conscience and to our heart. These are all things that are hard to do today. We need to take time to do that and not be afraid to do that and not just listen to sort of the ideologies that are, swirling around us. So I think that's one of the main invitations of this commandment. So all of those concepts, all of those realities we've just talked about brings us into the key that helps us to understand this commandment. Because sexuality, again, affects all the aspects of the human person. Body, soul, affectivity, the capacity to love, the capacity to procreate, the aptitude for forming bonds of communion, even friendship. All of this is encompassed in this particular commandment. That is why this commandment has to do with chastity and the monks that prayed here and lived in these mountains. It's not just a virtue, which is for people like me who are consecrated to God, like the monks here. It's for everyone to be able to live fully who they are as human beings. In fact, sexuality becomes truly personal and human when it is integrated into the relationship of one person to another in the complete, lifelong, mutual gift of men and women. That's why complementarity is so important. But chastity involves these two things: integrity of the person, and integrality of the person. It's kind of a weird word, but it means integral. He's whole, he's complete. So first of all, what about the integrity of the person? Well, the chaste person maintains the integrity of the powers of life and love. All of those powers that are placed within him. This integrity ensures the unity of the person. So it's opposed to any behavior that would impair it. What does that mean? Well, living a double life, for example, or a duplicity in speech, which we'll talk about as well. But mostly it's dealing with the apprenticeship of self-mastery. It's something which takes time to learn. There'll be ups and there'll be downs, there'll be mistakes, there'll be sins, and there'll be redemption, thanks be to God. But this is a training in human freedom. Self-mastery is one of the reasons they had to go through the desert for 40 years, so that they could learn about this to be truly free. I always think about how long it would take to really play the guitar beautifully or play the piano beautifully, to be free, to make music like that. It takes a lot of self-mastery and discipline. But that is what we're talking about with chastity. Because the alternative in this particular topic is that man is either self-mastered and free, or he is completely governed by his passions and then becomes deeply unhappy. I think we see that in the world around us. So man's dignity requires him to act out of conscience and free choice, moved and drawn in a personal way from within, and not by blind impulses in himself or by external constraints. You can't do this. Oh, we've seen what happens when people are just under laws like that. As soon as they go to college, as soon as they're free, something breaks because it's not coming from within. So mankind gains great dignity when ridding himself of all slavery to the passions, and by diligence and skill, the self-mastery, he effectively secures for himself the means suited to the end, to be able to love and enter into healthy relationship. That is what integrity means. And how do we do this? Well, self-knowledge. I think we're not afraid to talk about these topics anymore, different stages in life, times in our life, times of the year, times of the month, different ages in life. It's different to live chastity at 16 than 60, 40 than 90. There's always the need to know ourselves better, to know ourselves more, and to live this ascesis, fidelity to prayer and self-knowledge, so that we're not surprised by what's happening to us, and we can really make sure that our passions are permeated with reason and with revelation. That, I think, is the biggest invitation for the sixth commandment. Another thing I just wanted to point out in terms of integrity, that is a societal level. Society should actually promote chastity. It's a cultural effort. It's a cultural effort, because otherwise we can be impoverished. And that's why chastity is a moral virtue and a grace. So the second characteristic of living chastity for all of us is integrality, to be integral, to be, this is something which touches all of us. And this simply means the way that we give ourselves, the way that we love. And that's why we can say self-mastery is ordered to the gift of self. I cannot give myself unless all of myself is involved in the self-giving, because then I'm really just guided by the passions. And one of the things I want to underline here is actually this commandment talks a lot about friendship. And if you read C.S. Lewis's book called The Four Loves, he actually discusses how friendship is the highest way and the highest form of love. And so you're like, oh, that's really interesting, but I invite you to look more into that. So what I wanted to mention now, just as we end, is, are the different things that this commandment points us to which are offenses against chastity. If it's calling us to live this, then how do we not live it? Well, lust is the disordered desire for inordinate enjoyment of sexual pleasure. Okay, it's morally disordered when it's sought for itself, or isolated from giving life, and isolated from unifying myself with somebody that I'm committed to. There's no relationship involved in that. And remember, from the very beginning, this is the whole point of our creation, to be brought into relationship, not just with the Lord, but with one another, and with one another in Him. Clearly, another offense, fornication, the carnal union between unmarried men and an unmarried woman. This is actually contrary to the dignity of both. The dignity of both, because there is no commitment there. And that actually damages people greatly, but it's very, very common, and it can become quite a scandal. And it takes a lot to dig yourself out of that type of hole when that happens. So clearly an offense against chastity is pornography, mostly because of the intimacy which is lost, and it becomes a plastic way of self-giving. It's not a real integrated and integral self-giving. Another, of course, of just prostitution. I recently read that there's one of the states in the U.S. that just legalized this. And it's really a problem. What is happening in our society? Because you're injuring the dignity of the people who are being sold as objects. That's what this particular commandment is trying to guard against. People, who we are, is so much more valuable than that. And finally, of course, anything like rape and incest, that's a grave damage that marks the victim for life. It's a violation of the intimacy and relationship that we're all called to. And finally, this is quite difficult to talk about, but if we're going to be really coherent with who we are as Christians, we have to look at homosexuality, the relations, intimate relations between men or between women who experience this exclusive or predominant sexual attraction toward persons of the same sex. It's really hard to talk about this. I'm going to give a few, for everybody in society. I'll give you a couple of resources in the notes here today that you can, and I invite you to look more into, because we love all of them. I think all of us have friends, maybe family members that are involved in something like this, or even like transsexual, all of these different, ideologies that are happening and really affecting people in the world of today. But what is difficult here is we're going against something which is revealed and something which is reasonable in terms of our complementarity, the reality that we're man and woman, the reality that together we're called to give life. So in that sense, it's important to dig deep so that you and I can both speak about these types of issues with really with a lot of conviction. But as we finish this day and we look at the monastery in the ideal and the beauty of what God calls us to, sometimes, exemplified by, monks or martyrs or other people who give witness to the faith. Let's take our own commandments out. That second tablet that we're working on the sixth commandment, and we're writing down those things that we think the Holy Spirit might be asking us to work on during this Lent or dig deeper into. Maybe it is understanding a little bit more about realities of gender ideology. Maybe I need to understand better my own self, or maybe I really need to work on an integral chastity, or know how to live chastity in my marriage, or if I'm engaged or whatever. So I invite you to think about that and to pray about that with the Lord. And really, from here, from the Holy Land, our team is praying for all of you so that we all can learn how to love in the way the Lord made us, and in fullness of joy and goodness, so that we can be integral, happy people for all eternity and last like these buildings have lasted, even more. So God bless you, and we hope you can join us again tomorrow as we continue coming through the desert with all of you as we make our way together to true freedom.